Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm going to take a bit longer to allow people to log on before we start the second day of the conference. So just bear with me, please, a little longer before we start. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to see you online. I'm just going to give people a little bit more time to log on before we start. It's a very early start again here on Canadian side, 7 a.m. And I propose we just kick it off. Thank you all for joining us at this early time. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Welcome to the second day of the conference. I hope you enjoyed the first day. We have a great second day ahead of us with 2 keynote speeches today and 1 panel discussion. And I'm going to jump in right away. It's my pleasure to introduce the first keynote speaker of today, Dr. Inga Jakos. Dr. Jakos is the regional representative of the International Water Management Institute's Southern Africa Regional Office. She's a political scientist and has a PhD in international relations from St. Andrews University in Scotland. She specializes in environmental and water governance, and current areas of focus include climate information service delivery, politics of climate change, water, energy, food nexus, governance frameworks around the water, energy, food nexus, water stewardship, community-based approaches to water stewardship, hybrid water law, and environmental migration. Before joining IMWI, Inga was the research group leader of the Integrated Water Solutions Group at CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. And prior to that, she was the executive manager for business development, marketing, and communications at the Water Research Commission in South Africa. In her talk today, Dr. Jakos will focus on community-based approaches to achieving water and food security in Africa and connect policy to practice. And like yesterday, please add your questions for Dr. Jakos during or after her keynote in the Q&A box, and I'll help her then to get to these questions after she finishes her presentation. Dr. Jakos, we're very honored to have you here with us this morning. I'm very happy to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Roy. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Colleagues from Waterloo and around the world, wherever you are. I am greeting you from very sunny South Africa, midday around lunchtime. And as I do that, I'm happy to share my screen. I hope you can all see that okay. Roy, can you confirm that you're able to see things? All right.
Yes. Yeah, it looks
okay,
good.
Wonderful. Excellent, great. And so, as Roy mentioned, I dabble in a few things related to the politics of water and the environment. And something that I'd like to share with you today is on our work, emerging, but over a decade of work now on community-based approaches. And I will be presenting 2 sort of linked but 2 distinct areas of work, and so my presentation will focus on, first of all, contextualizing what the water and food security challenge is in terms of water service delivery in sub-Saharan Africa, but of course I live and work in Southern Africa, so that will take a little bit of priority if you'll allow me. And then I'd like to share with you some of the outcomes of our work over several projects, research for development projects at the International Water Management Institute, where I'm based, but also with partners like the FAO, the Environmental Law Institute, the Water Integrity Network, and several ministries of water, ministries of agriculture in the countries that we work. Also, this is sort of a work in progress. It is constantly evolving through policy dialogue with ministries, with different organizations. So I will share that with you, and then lastly, share some principles, or rather practical tools and approaches of how we can really institutionalize more responsible governance of water tenure, and specifically customary water tenure. So I'll describe that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the story that I'd like to paint, or the picture that I'd like to paint, first of all, is one of quite a concern for us living and working in the region around water service delivery. What has happened in several countries in Southern Africa, perhaps even broader sub-Saharan Africa in many countries, is that water service delivery has become less and less reliable. Now, just some global statistics, for example, in 2020, 1 in 4 people did not have access to safe drinking water. Now, safely managed drinking water is water from an improved water source, which is located either on premises or available when needed and free from contamination. And what we see, you can see the map in the bottom. Let me try to just put my pointer on so I can just show you in terms of the map in the bottom of the screen there. You'll see that countries at the low income countries tend to, of course, suffer the bulk of this inaccess. Less than 1/3 of the population in many countries in sub-Saharan Africa do not have access to safe water. And what we also know is that there's very little progress that's been made in the last 5 years with regards to the SDGs. We see that in 2015, for example, only 70% of the global population had safe drinking water. And now in 2020, 5 years later, this has only improved by about 4 percentage points. So our progress in terms of water service delivery has been quite slow. And what that means for countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southern Africa is that water management still by and large benefits the big users. It still marginalizes the most vulnerable. What do I mean by this? Well, we see that in programs around water allocation reform, for example, they still tend to either not be implemented properly. Systems are not in place to really drive these processes at the local government level. At the same time, licensing, water use licenses based on, colonial law of permits are costly. They are very lengthy, and many times they are inaccessible to poor South Africans, or even in other countries where they have these systems. And so what that means oftentimes is that it almost criminalizes, I'll dare to say, it almost criminalizes those without a license. It marginalizes historically disadvantaged individuals, like our black smallholder farmers in South Africa, for example, who are unable to afford these licenses, or make ends meet out of the very lengthy bureaucratic red tape to be able to apply for these licenses. And then it also puts pressure on the state to enforce or regulate the non-payment of these licenses. So what we have done with partners, and this is the first example that I'd like to introduce to you of one such community-based approach, which we call multiple use water services. This is really taking this context, these challenges into consideration, and then trying to address this very old problem of conventional water infrastructure services. What happens oftentimes in the region where I'm from, we have a conventional water service planning cycle where a high-level government department, ministry provides funding to a district level. Pre-feasibility studies are conducted. They're often outsourced to big engineering companies. And what we see more often than not, unfortunately, is that there is most times an elected political elite, councillors, that then select the contractors. Winning contractors then are often external to the community, so they are big companies that are able to provide, the necessary compliance documents, tax clearance certificates, and what have you. And what happens is they come into communities, they procure equipment, material, they construct, and oftentimes with very little or no consultation with those communities. What happens in the design or construction is that this infrastructure is often delayed, it's unfinished, or worse yet, it is even vandalized, neglected, and abandoned by the communities because there is no ownership, there's no sustainability, and at the end of the day, communities are no better off. And so how do we strengthen accountability from the bottom up? And so this notion of multiple use water services is a really valuable one in this context, because what multiple use water services does is it is a holistic participatory approach to planning and providing water services that really puts people at the center. It considers their multiple needs for water, and it is really community centric, in that communities are then coordinating the planning, the implementation, sometimes even the financing of this infrastructure. They coordinate with government as needed, and what you see is the involvement of many more stakeholders than the traditional response. And you can see some of the pictures in the slide where communities actually map out what their water needs are, and prioritize as well as budget based on these needs. Now, our first project was in this domain. Was we then worked in a province in South Africa called the Limpopo province, some many years back already, where we tried to demonstrate this multiple use water services. We made the case in a previous and an early project, and so this one was really trying to look at how can we scale this into several communities. And we looked at 6 diverse villages in the Limpopo province, where IMI, IMI, my organization that I represent, focused a lot on the capacity and the knowledge strengthening. So IMI was really just a broker and a facilitator of partnerships, if you can think about it in that way. And the idea then was then to look at how do we scale this multiple use water services to other downstream investments. So how do we build this momentum for the model? And you can see in the circle in the bottom side of the screen on the left, that was our approach. It was this kind of 6-phase approach where we worked with the communities to introduce this notion of multiple use water services. We supported the community to diagnose what the challenges were with regards to water access, supported them in co-developing a visioning or conducting a visioning exercise where they identified what their priorities were. Then we worked on planning, budgeting, prioritizing, the many needs that came out of the visioning process, and then sort of shortlisted it into this priority plan, and then implemented it, constructing, really putting in the infrastructure by the communities, and lastly then providing just support for sustainability, which meant that communities then either developed trusts or they developed cooperatives to then manage these assets once they were developed. And they were a wide range of infrastructure priorities, from improving reticulation systems to drilling boreholes, to maybe just even piping, getting water from a stream or a water source more upstream down to a community. Now, what were some of the success stories of this? And it was challenging. Don't get me wrong. This is not sort of completely a silver bullet. I'm not trying to advocate for multiple use services in every situation, but what it did was it prioritized and it sort of emphasized multiplicity as the norm. This means that water in rural sub-Saharan Africa is often multiple use. So people use water for multiple purposes, which is oftentimes, it's so self-explanatory. It sounds so intuitive to say it, but when we think of how infrastructure development happens, single source, single use dams, for example, then you really get to understand, why we need to emphasize this point of water is multiple use. It is multiple source. So people don't only get their water from one source, and oftentimes there are multiple sites of use. So it's not only a homestead, a single household using it on a plot. Oftentimes their farming plot is some ways away from where their house is. So people are using water and having to transfer water in these instances. Self-supply is by far the most important source at the homestead level. And what we also find is that local procurement is cheaper in this way when you work with communities, when there is this community-based approach. It's far cheaper than the public tendering process, which costs oftentimes up to 35% more. And what we found is that it can, not always, but it can create more jobs because there's this emphasis on local construction, local job creation. So communities then set up multiple use water service forums or moose forums that then, as I said before, were then evolved into some kind of trust or some kind of cooperative. That then was registered as a viable business or NGO, and that created several jobs for communities. And for us, I think the most important success outcome out of this approach was that it created this local ownership. Even if the infrastructure was perhaps not the most, the biggest hard infrastructure, there was really this sense of ownership that that communities had. They even co-financed the construction and the implementation of this, and then capacities were developed. When we worked in the community, something that I just remember from that experience was, an old Malumia, sort of a grandfather type person, an elder in the community, saying that he has become an engineer in his community. So things like that were really were some of the main success stories out of this. But while we only worked in these 6 communities in one province in South Africa, what we realized is that there are many more communities like this. In fact, when we did an irrigated area mapping exercise of the entire province, what we found just in this Limpopo province area was that approximately 35,000 smallholder farmers or producers spreading over 70,000 hectares of land had these very small, less than 2-hectare plots managed through customary water tenure and using or sort of managing water also through this kind of self-supply modality. And this now brings me to the second case that I'd like to share with you, which is now moving from infrastructure or water service delivery that is managed through self-supply to then looking at how we institutionalize this. Because while we had this case of 6 communities, our concern and our objective was always to see how can we institutionalize these approaches into local government planning. How do we get these more customary ways of managing water, customary water tenure, into statutory water law? And so this is now the next example that I'd like to introduce, which is this notion of hybrid water law, taking notions of maybe non-statutory ways of managing water in the legal sense, and having that be acknowledged in these other statutory legal systems. Now, what we started this work about 5 years ago or so, and we started perhaps a little bit sensationalist, sort of talking about how do we decolonize water, but at the heart of it, it was really something quite simple. It was really about how do we embed and institutionalize these community-based approaches into statutory water law. So what does that mean? Customary water tenure, what we see is it is by far, again, the most accepted way of managing water in rural sub-Saharan Africa. It is notions of managing water that could either be by birthright, it could either be by tribal authority, it could either be by some kind of religious notions, but really there were these 3 areas that we saw how water is typically managed in this customary water tenure frame. Sharing in is one, sharing out through neighboring communities, and then sharing out with third parties. So sharing in is really about how, perhaps through birth or through manage, rights to water are managed within a community's territory. So this could be how we prioritize domestic and basic productive uses. It is often a way of conflict resolution between community members, but it is that kind of descent-based way of managing water, or rather where a member of a group, a descent-based collective, shares water with others in the community. Sharing out is where water is then shared with neighboring communities. This could be informal river boards, as what we see with hill furrows in Tanzania, for example. It could be with tribal authorities, negotiating rights and access to water between different communities. And then the third example was sharing out, where you have a third, more powerful party, an industry coming in, and oftentimes what we see there is where you do need some state protection of customary water tenure. Now when we looked in countries in the region, South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, what we saw is this kind of inverted triangle where how water is shared out. Where you have, I don't want to sort of say specifically because it varies, you know, depending on the context, but often what we see is that between 70 and 90% of water is used by about 10% of the users. So that's really that water is still in the hands of very big impact, big users like industry, agriculture, commercial agriculture, and oftentimes smallholder farmers, other, you know, marginalized water users, making up the majority of users, still use very, very little of the water in a particular catchment at the local level. And so when we looked at this situation, we then looked at, well, how do we then how do we get it more acknowledged, better recognized, better embedded in statutory water law? Now just take, for example, the case of Kenya, where you've got a 1929 act that vested ownership of water resources in colonial powers. It granted permits to settlers, and basically it sort of, you know, obliterated any kind of African customary water tenure arrangements at the time. A century later, we see many of those permit obligations still exist, except now it's to everyone. So what we've done is we've scaled these permit systems, and again, not recognizing customary water tenure. At least in the case of Kenya, there's no tradable water, you know, no tradable commodity. There is a proportionate logistics. So that means that there are different categories of users that are given different types of permits. And the surprising thing, not only with Kenya, I should say, with several countries again, is that customary water tenure is often better recognized in land law than it is in water law. So that's also something that we try to look at. How do we sort of reconcile how water is recognized in other, whether it's land, environment, forestry laws, more so than in our water laws. And what we try to then do is we try to align a suite of legal tools. So what we said is, what if we targeted conditional licensing only to these high risk or big users, right? We focus, given the state's inability to regulate the backlogs of licensings that they experience, what if we only target the licensing at the biggest level? And then we use customary water tenure, hybrid water law approaches to then manage small users. That's how we started off, right? And we targeted these permit systems, looked at how we could enforce conditions from infrastructure planning onwards. We looked at existing uses, legal instruments that sort of institutionalize existing users. In South Africa, we've got a system called existing lawful use, which was when South Africa changed from you know, apartheid systems to our democratic dispensation. This was a sort of a safeguard to sort of provide this buffer for big commercial agriculture. But what we're now looking at is to say, oftentimes that still entrenches water in the hands of these big impact users. So 20 years later, we need to look at perhaps a use it or lose it. How do we slowly move away from these kind of, you know, existing use instruments that perpetuate these inequalities? And then lastly, we looked at how can we, from the national level, actually from the constitutional level, how do we respect and protect customary water tenure in different laws, water laws? The main thing that we found more recently is that we can focus on the prioritization, which oftentimes exists in water resource strategies or water plans, where there is already some type of prioritization of uses that already exist. So if we also target some of these the prioritization, it's sometimes a little bit easier than changing legal instruments of law, which we found to be quite challenging at the end of the day. So what we then did was in another project, we looked at how do we operationalize this hybrid water law approach. The partners are on the left of the screen, but we worked in with a catchment management agency, so that's very much at the local the catchment level. We worked with the Water Research Commission of South Africa, the Department of Water and Sanitation, as well as several research partners, Environmental Law Institute, Wits University in South Africa, the Water Integrity Network, which is a global network, and of course IMI. And we tried then to look at how do we first of all identify which legal tools, which legal instruments can we identify at the local level to then operationalize this. How do we then support a catchment management agency like the Inkumati Usutu Catchment Management Agency to then implement hybrid water law? So we looked at their water allocation plans, for example. And what we then found, and this is just in summary, and I will end off soon, is that first of all, we looked, given the prioritization of water users that is enshrined in South Africa's National Water Resource Strategy, which first of all prioritizes the ecological or the basic human need reserve. Oftentimes the way we interpret that reserve in South Africa is water for the environment. But what we've been saying is that that should be redefined, because while it includes a basic human need reserve of 25 liters per person per day, this should be able to be expanded to include multiple basic uses. That was the first thing. The second thing that we then looked at is how do we use existing instruments like our National Water Act, the reserve, our general authorizations, all these other tools, these legal tools, to recognize customary water tenure. The third recommendation that we made is that we need to give the tenure priority after the reserve and international obligation. So in our National Water Resource Management Strategy, after the reserve, we have to prioritize international obligations. So that is water, transboundary water that is shared between countries, between neighboring countries. But after that, we actually do have in our prioritization that we can that we should, not can, we should prioritize water for poverty eradication, for improved livelihoods, and greater racial and gender equity. It's just how we implement this is not always the case. In fact, we often tend to prioritize the fourth user, which is our strategic water users or water for economic purposes. We look at how do we give that priority more weight in water allocation plans, for example. Now, I should say also in closing that you know, what we're trying to do with this work is not to romanticize customary water tenure. I should say that. In the way that we do not romanticize statutory water law, the idea is that we do also realize at times that there are sometimes inequalities, whether they are gender or racial inequalities that exist and in customary water tenure that perpetuated tribal management structures that may sort of exclude women from accessing land and how that impacts their water access, for example. So this is not to sort of look at this is to identify where those discriminatory practices are, and to look at also how we work with communities to move away from those practices. So really addressing those systemic barriers to inclusion. And then the last recommendation was just then that we should be focusing on how to enforce more strict licensing. So we're not saying we do away with the permit system, but that we really enforce stricter licensing for high impact users, and perhaps less onerous, more adaptive management, customary water tenure for lower impact users. So this is just some of the work that we've already done on this. If you are interested, there is at the moment an encouraging global momentum that has emerged as a result of global partner action, the FAO, Environmental Law Institute, IMI, and others, to get countries to recognize customary water tenure. The FAO, for example, they have the Great Water Tenure Monday, which is a regular event that happens. If you're interested in learning more about that, there's also a lot of work being done at the moment on local assessments and country dialogues on how to inform or how to support policymakers to identify which legal instruments can be targeted to better acknowledge customary water tenure. But we do know that there is a capacity gap. Working with policymakers is our next priority. Establishing guidelines on how policymakers can best tackle this, how they can identify which instruments and how to do it. And so that is our next step, developing these kind of technical guidelines to facilitate implementation. Of course, as we move along with this, endorsement of these guiding principles is also something that we work to, and there is an international committee on world food security that we are working through at the international level to do so. So with that, folks, I hope that was interesting, and I hope it shared just a little bit of insights on two types of community-based approaches to achieve this water security that we always strive for. So thank you so much, and Roy, back to you.
Thank you so much, Inga. That was amazing. Thank you so much for this overview. Much needed. We don't have a lot of presentations, or I at least don't see a lot of presentations that focus on the important law aspects of water. So we have time for questions. So for the audience, please add your questions in the Q&A box. I'll start with some questions of my own, Inga, if you don't mind. And I'll give other people the opportunity to enter their questions in the Q&A box. So one very general question that came up in my mind was, so IMI seems to play quite a central role in these different community-based approaches that you talked about. Can you talk us through a little bit more, perhaps, how central the role is of IMI or in organizations like IMI in initiating this and also sustaining perhaps these approaches? So you initiate it and then you build capacity. What are your experiences with then afterwards maybe also sustaining these initiatives?
Thanks, Roy. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it sort of makes me be sort of very reflexive a little bit. I would say, IMI's role in this work is that of as I said, a facilitation partner or a broker, bringing partners together, supporting communities. Oftentimes what we find is communities know what challenges they have, right? They also know often better than external partners what water sources are most appropriate for their needs. What an external facilitator, broker, partner does is it helps it helps sort of bridge the gap between the community and municipalities. And that, I think, is where IMI has played a role. But you know, to be reflexive, as I said, we in this case anyway, not in all cases, but in this case, IMI tries to be the organization to put ourselves out of business, right? So ideally, we shouldn't have to be there. We shouldn't have to be the broker. Communities should be able to engage with municipalities in a co-management modality, but we know that that is not yet there. What we see, for example, is once communities construct infrastructure, once they are able to maintain that infrastructure, how do you get a municipality to partner and sort of support the maintenance of that? Because that asset is not on the municipality's asset register. So then it becomes the sole responsibility of a community to maintain that until, you know, time immemorial. And there should be a role. There should be a role for communities, for municipalities to support. But that is not quite there. And oftentimes also there is a lot of friction. There's tension between communities and municipalities, especially where there is a lack of service delivery, where there are, you know, these bottlenecks. Communities do protest. They rise up against municipalities, and so in those cases there is the need for kind of a neutral broker. Okay, thank you. And it's just from my understanding, is it also the case that when you talk about these big industry water users, you're talking really about the investments in the necessary infrastructure to get the water to the users? It's not a matter of not having enough water where most of the water is allocated to one particular user. It's really the investment in the necessary infrastructure to get it to the user. Is that correct? Yes, well, I mean, there is a case. I mean, you know, when we talk about the big users, we are talking about it's commercial agriculture or it's industry, right? And so oftentimes they can afford, you know, the licenses. They have teams, you know, supporting them with the permit application processes, and also sometimes they can, you know, work with communities, with municipalities to co-fund the infrastructure development. So I think there's a little bit of both. I think there is, on the one hand, the investment put in, but there is also, you know, the use. Interesting, just on this question, you know, what's come up almost as a critique to this work, if I can say it, put it like that. At our first engagement with catchment management agencies, for example, was saying, you know, the getting nervous. They were sort of nervous about institutionalizing approaches like this, because what it meant was then, you know, they would speak about a paper right, especially in, as you said, stressed catchments where water is already over allocated. So what would this mean, you know, if we are we saying that we would now have to take water away from industry and give it to marginalized groups or communities, and that creates quite a tension for those who are implementing, you know, like catchment management agencies. But for us, our approach has then been, as I said, compulsory licensing is something that does exist in the water allocation reform processes, but the main thing is about just enforcing and being stricter about that licensing process of big impact users. Okay, thank you. In the meantime, we've had some questions. So I'm just going to start from the top. So Aaron Morrison is asking, does your program and plans go out to the least able to get healthy water and suffer because of it? I assume the answer is yes. Do you see it? I do. I'm not quite sure how to interpret the question, Aaron. Does your program plans or work go out to the least able to get healthy water and stuff. Yes, yes. And I mean, our main partner, right? If I can put it that, our main beneficiary is the smallholder farmer. In South Africa, it's the black smallholder farmer, right? That is often marginalized in these situations, that doesn't have water to be able to produce, to irrigate a small 2-hectare plot of land. So customary water tenure and institutionalizing it is trying to ensure that there is water for these kinds of users.
Perfect. Thank you. So Masood is asking, he's in Pakistan, where they're suffering from devastating floods, as you probably know. And so he's talking about these floods, and he also says that they've been suffering a lot from droughts as well. And he calls it the precipitation shift. And he asks you, are there any such climate change patterns being witnessed in Africa?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Masood. I mean, in fact, it was just some months back, we experienced debilitating floods on the coast of Southern Africa. Now, we always experience floods, from South Africa all the way up, along the east coast to Mozambique, Malawi. But what we are seeing as these floods experienced now are much more severe and much more frequent. So definitely, and we are still recovering. We are still recovering from that, and that happened sort of in the beginning of this year. But massive devastation.
Thank you. We have an anonymous attendee who is a political scientist working in the water domain, and she or he is asking, can you comment on your experience working with natural or engineering scientists and the role of interdisciplinarity in advancing SDG 6?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yes, I mean, I think, all my life I've been a social scientist working in a natural science dominated world. And the first part of my career was to fight to get social science or transdisciplinary approaches onto the agenda. And I realized that only gets you so far. And more in more sort of recent years, I've taken an approach of leading. So rather than focusing on social approaches, getting into natural science research projects, for example, I now focus on leading with social science approaches and getting natural science into those types of projects. So that's my approach. The role of interdisciplinary in advancing SDG 6. I mean, that's a very interesting notion, because SDGs don't have any disciplinary boundaries, but there is a very good role, and something that we're actually doing in a totally different project is looking at how do we focus on the development of indicators for resource-related SDGs, like SDG 6, where you have a situation, there are global indicators that either get adopted by countries, or sometimes countries have more bottom-up indicators that are developed based on other processes at the national level, but oftentimes countries don't have this, or they haven't gone through this process, some more than others in the region. And so working with governments to sort of envision what is it that they want to achieve, how to operationalize that and to set objectives is something that is a very interdisciplinary process that we are working on. My colleague Chris Dickens does quite a bit of work in the region. If the person asking the question wants to know more, I'm happy to share some of that.
Thank you. So E Wotsai, I don't know what the first name is, asks, is there guidance on right-of-way and land acquisition for water lines through private or community lands? In your case studies, I assume.
Oh, yeah, that one is a very tricky question, and I think it depends on the national law. Unfortunately, in many countries there isn't. So and I should say, I mean, in other parts of the world, I think there are really innovative ways in which countries have done this. I know that in New Zealand, there are really sort of rights to water. The water has a right on its own, if you can think about it like that. Not at the moment, but I mean, in countries like South Africa, but it's a really interesting point. I mean, what we have at the moment is water rights that are apportionment, which is basically they run with the land and not to the owner, right? So you still see a lot of those kind of approaches being implemented, but yeah, I mean, I don't have an elegant answer for that, other than it's a constant process that we work on.
Okay, one last question, Inga, if you don't mind. It's from Predrag Racic, and he says that your talk reminds him of Hernando de Soto's Mystery of Capital. Not sure if you've heard of it, but apparently the author explains differences in the development across countries by describing how legal structures are putting prohibitive transaction and administrative costs on the owners of the resources, and these owners are outside the official legal structures and thus cannot utilize the resources to their full potential. Could you comment a bit more on the extent to which this is the case in your study areas?
I think I'd need to know a little bit more about the mystery of capital in this case, Roy. Predrag, I don't know if you're able to come off mute and maybe just share a little bit more, but I'd love to hear a bit more. I won't be able to necessarily comment on that.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, I propose we stop here. Thank you, Inga, very much once again. If we would be meeting in person, as I also said yesterday with the keynote speaker at that time, we would stand up and give you a big round of applause. Thank you so much for being with us here this morning and sharing your experiences with us and addressing this important issue of environmental justice in the water domain. And you gave us great examples of the work that you're doing on interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. Thank you so much for all your contributions. For the audience, thank you for your questions and for your engagement with this excellent presentation. We have lots of compliments, Inga, in the chat box, people who enjoyed your talk. We're gonna go out for a short break for 8 minutes, and then we'll come back with a panel discussion. Thank you, Inga, once again for being with us.
Thank you so much, Roy, and thanks to everyone for listening. Thank you.
Thank you. See you again in 8 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. We're moving into the panel session of today. Unfortunately, one of the panelists is MIA, missing in action, and also the moderator has not come online. So no panic, we already just did that behind the screens. I'm going to moderate the session with Arkisman Mitra and Julian Sohn. So Arkisman and Julian, if you don't mind, please switch on your cameras and we'll start the session. And if Douglas is able to join us at a later point, we'll just have him added to the panel session. So welcome back everyone. I hope you enjoyed this first keynote talk of the day by Inga, Jakos, Mata. We're gonna have a discussion very much along the lines as we had them yesterday. We've invited a number of QES scholars into the panel session. We're gonna share with you some of the experiences that they had in their cases in QES. They're going to talk about the outcomes, how they experience the local engagement with partner organizations, and how these collaborations helped the outcome of their projects. So I'm going to start with Julian. Julian, can I ask you to briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your field of expertise, what you worked on in the QES program, and with whom?
Thank you, Roy. Good morning, everyone. I'm a PhD student at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. I am an environmental engineer, and during my master's, my work was associated with surface hydrology and best management practices in the context of payment for ecosystem services schemes. So I became more interested in a more hydrological perspective of water security challenges and better understanding the intertwined feedback between society and droughts, especially under climate change. And my PhD is focused on the benefits of nature-based solutions for improving water security in urban centers and their related economic costs. In the QES program, I worked on the design and implementation of choice experiment to investigate public willingness to pay for conservation measures to improve people's water security. And one of the study sites, study cities is the metropolitan region of São Paulo, with nearly 21 million inhabitants, which are partially supplied by a large and complex system with 6 interconnected reservoirs. And as a preliminary finding, approximately 70% of the São Paulo population has faced water restrictions up to 5 times over the last 10 years. That means every other year. And I worked in this project with Professor Roy Brower and local government and watershed managers in Brazil. And the QES program gave me this opportunity to build a professional network that is beyond the university. This was very important to incorporate some stakeholders' needs and expectations regarding my research. Working with Professor Roy in learning from his experience and his expertise has also been fundamental for conducting my research, especially when applying the economic theory and models in the interface of hydrology and economy needed to achieve my goals. Our research is intended to inform decision in policymaking to enhance future water security in Brazil. We also aim to understand people's preference for different nature-based solutions to protect and conserve water provision at watersheds responsible for supplying important cities in Brazil. Also, we are currently assessing how possible reductions in the frequency and duration of future water shortages are valued by the study population, taking into account those different water conservation measures to improve water supply. This research particularly contributes to reducing water inequalities in the access of sufficient water for sustaining, for example, socioeconomic development in urban centers. I think that it's a brief overview of my background and the work I've done so far.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Right.
And Sao Paulo is one of those so-called day zero cities, right? It's a mega city where they're coming very close, or they have been very close in the past to the situation where there was no more water for the urban population, like in Cape Town in South Africa, where we had similar issues. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Julian. So we'll get back to you after I introduce the second panelist, Arkisman Mitra. Arkisman, welcome also to the panel discussion, and also to you the same questions. Can you briefly introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit more about your background, your field of expertise, your project in QES, and what some of the outcomes were.
Thanks, Roy. So my name is Arkisman Mitra. I work at International Water Management Institute as a researcher in water resource economics. I'm also registered as an external PhD student in Vrije University, Amsterdam, with my advisor being Professor Roy Brouwer and also Dr. Soumya Balasubramaniam. So I work on issues around energy irrigation nexus and groundwater sustainability in South Asian agriculture. My work also is around ensuring equitable irrigation access for farmers and adoption of climate resilient agricultural practices in the region. So the work that I did, so I came to University of Waterloo under the QS program to work with Professor Roy Brouwer. And the work that I did was also one of my chapters in my PhD. So it is around a pilot experiment in Punjab, India. Punjab is a state in India, to incentivize farmers on reducing groundwater abstractions. So one of the critical challenges in that region is the rapid decline of groundwater levels due to over-extraction by the agriculture sector. Punjab is one of the worst affected states in that regard. So one of the reasons why groundwater abstraction is not at all at the socially optimal level is that both the groundwater is free and also the electricity required for pumping is also free. And electricity was made free to promote agricultural production in the region, but that led to excessive groundwater pumping. So the rapid decline in groundwater will adversely affect future generation of farmers in the regions and severely compromise food security in the country. Any agricultural crisis in the region would have disastrous effects in terms of intergenerational equity. So increasing price for electricity or reducing the supply of electricity will not be politically feasible and also will adversely affect the poorer farmers. So the challenge is to come up with a policy that does not adversely affect the poorer farmers, but also create incentives for them to optimize energy and water use. So under the QS program, I looked at a government policy that was piloted in Punjab to give farmers positive incentives in terms of quota of electricity. So each farmer were given a quota of electricity based on their pump horsepower. And if farmers use more electricity than their quota, they are not penalized. But if they use less than their quota, then they are given an incentive from the government. And so the idea is that this will create incentive for them to pump less groundwater. And we empirically test this policy in our research, and we do find that it was effective in terms of reducing groundwater abstraction. The average effect was around 25%. But we also recognize in our research that the effectiveness of this policy is really determined by local factors in terms of the cropping pattern, existence of groundwater market, etc. So so this is so we find that this is a possible mechanism for reducing groundwater abstraction, but one needs to be careful also while scaling this up. So out of the work this was recently published in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, and the policy also was itself scaled up by the government of Punjab to around 200 feeders, but the scaling up happened during the time of COVID, so that sort of it slowed down the scaling up. But our results basically under the QS program shows that such a policy can work in that region. So yeah, that's briefly my work.
Thank you, Arkisman. Thank you, Arkisman. That was a rural case study. So we had Julian working in an urban case study, Arkisman in a rural case study, and as many of you probably will know in the audience, groundwater pumping is a major issue in India, where demand for food is high, and groundwater aquifers are depleted at alarming rates. And Arkisman zoomed in on a hotspot area in India to see how that groundwater pumping could be reduced. And one of the major issues is the fact that electricity is or has been at least very cheap, relatively cheap, and so a lot of people are able to buy pumps to pump up the water and irrigate their lands with it. So very relevant case studies, Julian and Arkisman. So can you talk, Julian, a little bit more about the collaborations that you were having with, especially maybe the local partners on the ground? How instrumental have these collaborations been in your case study? You also had a local supervisor, Professor Edson Wendland. How did you experience that local collaboration, and how vital was that collaboration for you to design your research, for example?
Yeah, I work with not only researchers at my home university here at the University of São Paulo, but I also worked with local government and watershed managers responsible for decision and policy making related to water security in the study basins. I actually worked with two different watersheds in Brazil. So even though we collaborated remotely and had virtual meetings due to the pandemic of COVID-19, I experienced a little of their difficulties to develop strategies to manage water in a way that farmers' needs are fulfilled and the downstream water demand is also met, because we usually have conflicts of interest between the farmers settled in the watershed basins and the supply population downstream the basins. In the case of São Paulo, where we have like interconnected basins, inter-base water transfer, we have not only conflicts of interest of the downstream population, but we also have conflicts of interest of cities and population that it's far beyond the watershed. So policymakers and decision makers also struggle to manage this different kind of water uses. And for example, I also presented preliminary results related to the current and future water security under different climate change scenarios to watershed committee members. And they were very concerned about possible further deterioration of water security in the basin that is already having problems to supply the demands of farmers who usually carries out agriculture. They plant soybean, sugarcane, and also and under this scenario of water insecurity, they also are very concerned about supplying water to urban population that it's beyond the watershed boundaries. And in the QES program, I had a unique opportunity to have this practical experience to improve the research I'm doing, and also conduct a survey to understand the relationship between the supply population and water, and in their experiences with water scarcity. And having this broad view from different society sectors, I think it's of paramount importance if you want to come up with knowledge that really contributes to policy making and really contributes to change people's lives and so on. Throughout my academic career, I also learned that these challenges of effectively managing water resources, especially with many competing water uses within and beyond watershed boundaries, and experience that in practice while working with different stakeholders, water resources committees and managers, was very, very important to answer not only my research questions, but try to help them solve their daily issues and problems as well.
Thank you, Julian. And so, so you looked at nature-based solutions, as you said. So these nature-based solutions were also identified together with policymakers or decision makers or the farmers, because those were the that was the group that was asked to take those measures on their land. Correct?
Yeah. As I mentioned, I conducted a survey to investigate public preference. And prior to the survey, I had some meetings with these watershed committee members and to ask them their opinion about the nature-based solutions, if they really think that it's effective in their the watershed that they are managing, and then we found that we come up with 3 potential nature-based solutions in the specific watersheds. So yeah, it was a very interactive and collaborative work between the university, my side, and the watershed committee members.
Yeah, and both you and Arkesman are looking more economic instruments. Am I right in solving this? Because you're looking at what urban residents are willing to pay to offset the costs of these farmers. That is a little bit the model that you're using.
Yeah. I'm trying to integrate some hydrological modeling with economic modeling, because economy is also about scarcity, and I think that the best approach to improve water management under scarcity is to have economic tools to support decision making. And from my experience working with these different watershed committee, was that sometimes it lacks this some economic tools to support this decision making. So sometimes they play some kind of trying different approach to see what works and what really doesn't work.
Thank you. Arkesman, over to you. So to you also the question, how you experience the setup of the QES program, where you were working within the QES program with local partners. How essential was that for your research and for the outcomes that you managed to generate? You actually already have a paper based on the research that you did.
Thanks, Roy. So I think working in this QS program, during this QS program and working with the partners, my biggest learning was actually the importance of institutions for the success of these kind of policies. The fact of providing information to farmers, helping them through administrative hurdles of enrollment, keeping regular contact with them and providing solutions to them when they face any problems. So I found that all of these have huge transactional costs. And during the pilot, these transactional costs and projects, so even if these are done by development organizations or government departments, a lot of this cost is actually borne by the implementation agency, and they need to work very closely with the farmers for making them successful. But often there is also, during the scale up, often there will be a huge gap in available human resources with the government departments that will be working here. For example, the utility agencies that we were working in Punjab, they were really overstretched with human capital. So, and reaching the farmer, providing them with the information, outside the pilot project, they said it would be difficult. So achieving these SDG goals will often involve policies or technological innovations like the one that I worked on. But this will also need farmers and households to adapt to it. And while a proof of concept on how these policies work is needed, what I felt working during this project was that it is also important to identify these hidden transactional costs of implementing policy and make it easy where possible, or else include them as part of costing of the project. So I think this will be crucial for the long-term success of any policy that we find successful in a pilot or an RCT. And as you say, and just to add, another thing is the working in this, as Julian also mentioned, that this QS enables you to create a network, working in a network of researchers from different disciplines. So I sort of doubly realized the importance of transdisciplinary work in solving these kind of problems. For example, for my research, I had extensive interactions with agronomists and hydrologists, just even to contextualize our research findings. So we don't directly work with them, but I had interactions with them to contextualize my findings. And I think that substantially contributed to how we interpret the results. And so I think programs like QS sort of allowed for me to not only interact directly with people from different disciplines and from different countries, but also gave me exposure to talks, presentations, and research work of people from different disciplines, and often looking at the same problem, but from different angles. So that sort of makes the work more nuanced. So not just this specific work, I would say this has influenced me a lot in terms of how I approach my work and will do in future. So yeah, so that's what I would say my experience has been in terms of.
Thank you, Arkisman. And so you were referring to the utility, for example, being overstretched in terms of capacity. So the pilot that you were working on, this was set up also together with the World Bank. What role did the municipality and what role did the World Bank, for example, play in also maybe trying trying out the success of this pilot? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so I think one of the biggest challenges in that region was basically farmers were afraid that so for this program, they need to install meters. Before that, electricity was free, so they didn't need any meters. So farmers were afraid that if meters are installed, they will be charged money later on. So just to bring them to meetings, convince them, tell them the benefits, provide them the exact information. Like the program is not very difficult, but it has some just to understand what it entails. So that that role sort of is played by World Bank, and not just World Bank, they also work with other implementing agencies with whom we also work who sort of did this reaching out to farmers. So that was very crucial in terms of, and also there was administrative so for example, to get enrolled to the program, the name in the connection name has to be the same as the consumer name. So that if that often is not the case. So for example, if it has been passed out from earlier generations, so maybe my grandparent took the connection and now there's passed away, so I'm using it, but the connection is not in my name. So just to change that is a very difficult process to help with that. So yeah, so that sort of those roles have been played by the implementing agency.
Yeah, and so and the results that came out of your project, I heard you say that that groundwater use was reduced by 25%. I believe that was the number. So that seems fairly successful. So has this practice been adopted by the utilities, because they are the ones who are providing the subsidy to the farmer, if I understand correctly?
Yeah, so this has been scaled up. So this has already been scaled up, the program scaled up. So this pilot happened with 6 feeders. So it has been scaled up to, I think the target was 200 feeders. But the problem was it coincided with the COVID. Like it was supposed to start, I think, in 2020. And as I mentioned, that enrollment is the reaching out process requires people to go and that sort of thing. So it sort of slowed down due to COVID. So I am not exactly sure what the current enrollment rate is, but I was in touch with people who are working. So I sort of anecdotally know that during the 2 years of COVID, it sort of slowed down the scale up. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Julian, maybe back to you. Any major lessons learned? You already mentioned a little bit that you learned a lot from working with other disciplines. Also, you're trained as an engineer, and you were somewhat not forced, but you were working with an economist. In terms of expected impact, how do you see this kind of collaboration within the QES context help to improve or to increase impact? Do you have any expectations? I know you're still working on your data, so your work is still in progress. But do you have any expectations that you could share with us?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the major lesson I learned is also related to what Archieman said, that sometimes farmers and the population in general are not involved in the decision-making process, and because of that, they are very reluctant to accept some proposals to improve the water security, just because they sometimes don't understand what is going on, what is happening, the underpinning of the solutions they were presenting. For example, in the watersheds I have worked, farmers see the environmental agencies and government agencies sometimes as enemy, because they already struggle to carry out their economic activities with very restricted water budget. And sometimes the environmental agency comes to their property saying that they cannot do that. They have to stop carrying out agricultural activities in some places that should be protected, and they don't understand the reasons underlying these rules. So I think that this is the most important lesson. We should always try to involve, engage the community in the decision-making process. And in the QES program, I think that help me to also trying to incorporate this bottom-up approach in my research. Trying to understand the feedback between society and water scarcity, for example. That is also fundamental to if you want to have effective approaches. So and also the local government also sometimes they don't know how to engage the community. I participated in some public sections where the public government were trying to discuss some guidelines for water use in the watershed, but there was very few participation of farmers, because sometimes they think they are in different sides of this game. So yeah, we are as researchers try always to think of ways to engage the community, and also public sectors, government also struggle to engage the community, and sometimes they try but they fail. So I think that's the lesson I learned. Always trying to think of a bottom-up approach instead of a more conventional top-down one.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask both of you to maybe also think and share with us a little bit your thoughts about possible inequalities in your case studies. So one of the SDGs is about reducing inequality. Maybe Arkesman, if you don't mind, maybe I can start with you. Were there any specific inequalities in your case studies that maybe had to be addressed, or that might have been even a barrier to reduce, for example, groundwater pumping? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so from a very practical application of the policy, if we see the more influential farmers, the bigger farmers, they sort of, for them, as I mentioned, that there are these administrative costs related to enrollment. So for them, it is easier to sort of bear those costs. Also, for example, it is often looked at as a risky, although there is no risk as such in the policy for the farmer, because there's no chance of him getting a penalty if he crosses the limit, but because of the fear what government might do. So even there's this risk element, and here again, risky, it is easier for larger farmers or bigger farmers to sort of take a risky, to plunge into, to try it. And often they have maybe 2-3 pumps. So they will just try it with one pump. And if it works, then they will go with the other pumps also. And which is not the case for example, smaller farmers or so I think my feeling is that although this is not a technology, but it's a new policy, but as with any new technology, sort of these costs of adopting it and the risky nature of adopting it sort of makes it even easier for the larger farmers to take the benefits first. But here, what I feel is that probably with more information, with more engagement with the community, it is possible to sort of provide these benefits of this technology or this new policy to even the poorer farmers or the more marginalized sections, because the benefit is also will be much larger in terms of in the total total income that they have, the benefit would be much larger for the poorer farmers. So yeah, so again, I think community engagement and more responsive government is needed in terms of providing the benefits to the poorest farmers. So that sort of would be my response to.
Yeah, thank you, Augustman. Julian, any idea on your side? Are you dealing with smallholder farmers, for example, that are facing a mega city of 20 million thirsty residents? Any inequalities in your case?
Yeah, they always inequalities when we talk about water, and not only about water, but I experience that there are inequalities when you talk about decision making. Usually, when people participate and are engaged in this process, they are privileged with a privileged position or power, and sometimes marginalized people or doesn't have access to the decision making. In this kind of population, this portion of the population is usually the population that also suffers from unequal access to water. So this creates an imbalance to come up with solutions to improve water security, because this kind of people are more impacted by droughts and water scarcity, and sometimes they always, even though we have water availability to supply the demand, they always suffer from the lack of infrastructure to have access to water. So I think the biggest problems is the lack of access, equal access to the decision making, because the people that usually have problems to access and participate in the water management, in this integrated water management, is usually the kind of person that suffers most from this unequal access to water.
Yeah, thank you. And what role can research methods like surveys, public surveys, play in this? I think you surveyed a representative sample of residents in Sao Paulo, for example. So does that include people living in favelas or people with less access to reliable water supply?
In São Paulo is a very big city, and you always have like budget constraints when conducting survey. So we try to account for that for this share of the population by screening people's income, family income. So you try to get a more diversified income to draw some inferences of this also on this in this share of the population that has been marginalized. It's also a kind of methodological issue, because we cannot. It's very difficult to separate people that have been facing water restrictions due to water scarcity, an actual lack of water, and from those that is facing water restrictions and rationing because they don't have actually access to water. So yeah,
yeah, good point. That's a really good point. So we have a question from Ponu, professor in the University of Waterloo. He's thanking you both for your thoughts, and his question is, Do farmers understand the marginal value of water so pricing can be used? If pricing is not socially acceptable, are quotas more acceptable, he asks. He's also thinking of subsidies to farmers whose crop production is not good enough to offer them water, so water can be delivered to others who are not subsidized, something along the lines of carbon fee and dividend. Maybe Arkisman, do you want to give this a shot?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. So regarding your first question, do farmers understand the marginal value? They do actually, and but also there's a time lag between how quickly they understand it. So partly the results that we get in our experiment, that is partly just, so farmers in that region, they depend on a machine that keeps the pump. So the electricity comes during night. So they just keep the pumps running and sort of wasteful abstraction of groundwater that is happening there. So because of this policy, they sort of just stop the pump once they bear the cost of going to the field and stopping the pump from running. So that, but we would expect because of this price that they will even further decrease the water, which I feel will take further reduce, the less productive farmers will further reduce the water use, which I expect will take a few more years for them to adjust that water use. So about quota, actually, there is already a quota in terms of 8 hours of electricity supply. But even then, so even then for many farmers, because as I said, because of the supply schedules, they just keep the pump running. And this policy sort of is a way to make the farmers incentivized to stop the pump when the requirement is fulfilled. So quota is already there. Further increasing the quota, like reducing the hours of supply, would adversely affect some farmers who require the water, more farmers. And about this sort of, if I understand your question around carbon fee and dividend type of sort of, if I understood correctly, the main challenge here is targeting of farmers from which farmers to which farmers are having good crop production vis-a-vis which farmers are not having good crop production. I feel that that sort of monitoring would be very, very difficult. So yeah, so that would be sort of my response. I don't know if I addressed the question properly, but yeah. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Pono, and thank you, Arkisman, for answering. So maybe one last question to both of you. Any thoughts about your experiences, based on your experiences? What significant barriers you see when it comes to achieving some of these sustainable development goals, 6, water security, but also food security, closely related, of course. Anything that we have to think about in the future if we want to make some progress, more progress on achieving these sustainable development goals? Anything that you came across in your case study that you thought that's something that is quite important, whether it's related to very specifically the instrument that you were focusing on, the available capacity, institutional capacity, human resource capacity, social capital. You both alluded already a little bit to some of these issues. Is there anything that stands out for you? Maybe Julian, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest barriers are related to understand feedback between society and water, and especially water scarcity, to actually have a more participative and collaborative water management. And to mention, related to the previous question also, it's very interesting to see that farmers actually they value water water has value to them, but when we ask, so well, yeah, how much are you willing to pay for water, to have sufficient water to carry out your activity? They don't know the answer. So it's very difficult to attach value to water, but water is very valuable to them, because they starting to see they starting to have problems to continue with their agricultural activity, because water is lacking. I once was speaking with a farmer, and he said that when he was younger, he used to swim in the river, and now the water level is at his knees. So it's already visible, the lack of water. So bringing these experiences, the farmers and the society experiences in relationship with water, I think it's one of the biggest barriers to have equal access to water, and also improve water security. And sometimes it's also related to some kind of political will to come up with policy and strategies to bring the population and farmers into the decision making, because government always want to be in power and in control of the decisions made. So that's the biggest barrier I see.
Thank you, Julian. Arkesman, very briefly from your side.
Yeah, no, I would echo what Julian said, that valuing water, specifically the externality, is actually in future generations. So if you ask them, they will say they value water. They don't want their children, grandchildren to live in a state where there is no groundwater. But yeah, to put money value to that externality in terms of future generation is really, I feel, the challenge. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Arkesman. Thank you so much. There are no more questions. I'm going to close this session. Thank you very much, Arkesman and Julian, soon to be Dr. Julian Sohn, and soon to be Dr. Arkesman Mitra. Good luck with finishing your PhD theses on your research. Just a very short message. Dr. Gini, who was supposed to be here as well, unfortunately didn't have any reliable internet connection in Zambia to join the panel. So apologies that he's unable to join it, but we managed to make it till the end. We're going to take another 10 minutes break before we come back with the second keynote. My colleague, Professor Sarah Dixon Anderson, professor in the Department of Engineering at McMaster University here in Hamilton in Canada, will introduce the second and last keynote of the day. So we're going to have a 10-minute break, and we look forward to see you again at 9 a.m. sharp, University of Waterloo time. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan.
Bye.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back from the break. My name is Sarah Dixon Anderson, and I am a civil engineering professor at McMaster University. I have the distinct pleasure today of introducing our next keynote speaker, Dr. Dawit Makonnen. Just before I do that, I'm going to invite the audience that as you listen to Dr. Makonnen speak, you can put any questions that you might have in the Q&A box. We'll have a short Q&A session after the talk. So Dr. Dawit Makonnen is a research fellow in the Environment and Production Technology Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute. Dawit is based in IFPRI's headquarters in Washington, D.C. And his research interests include understanding the different aspects of the water, energy, food nexus, the economics of water resources, the impact of irrigation on agricultural productivity, nutrition, health, and women's empowerment, and impact evaluation of development projects. Dawit holds a PhD in agricultural and applied economics from the University of Georgia, an MSc and BA degrees in economics from Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. Dr. Makonnen is a well-established and highly productive scientist. Earlier this summer, he co-authored, among others, the article titled "The Role of Water in Transforming Food Systems" in the Journal of Global Food Security. So we're extremely pleased to have Dr. Makonnen with us today. Dawit, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Let me quickly share my slides. I hope you can see my slide, right?
Yes, it's coming up.
Perfect.
Perfect.
Thanks. So today I'll be talking about irrigation nutrition linkages with implications on the role of water in transforming food systems globally. This is a work that myself and a number of my colleagues at IFPRI have been doing the last few years under a project, Feed the Future project called Innovation Lab for Small Scale Irrigation. So these are the different partners, the logos of different partners you see at the end of the slide. In terms of outline of my presentation, I will talk a little bit about water in the food systems, and I understand that there has been discussions on SDG 6 yesterday and other SDGs as well. So my goal is to briefly link SDG 6 on water and sanitation with SDG 2, which is zero hunger and nutrition SDG. So I'll try to review SDG 6 in the context of nutrition so that we can set up how we think water should be considered as it relates to nutrition and health. Then particularly, I'll talk about the gaps that are missing in these linkages between SDG 6 and SDG 2, and particularly focus on one gap, which is our missing link to understand irrigation nutrition linkages. So by that, I will try to start with discussing potential pathways, how we think irrigation might be related to nutrition. And we'll go a little bit deeper to present studies or findings from studies in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Ghana. Then I'll come, so I'm trying to start with a bigger picture, go deeper a little bit in terms of providing findings from specific results, then zoom out again and try to provide the bigger picture on solutions to improve food system outcomes and improve water security. So I hope this zoom in, zoom out mode might work, but we'll see. Thanks a lot, first of all, for listening to this talk. So water, the most the important dimensions of water resources for human use are availability of water resources, access, quality, and stability. These are the most important characteristics of water as long as human needs are concerned. But these are intricately linked with food security and nutrition with different forward and backward loops in the form of food production, food processing, food preparation, as well as drinking and wash. There is also a need for energy for water and water for energy. For instance, energy takes about 10% of water resources withdrawn. There are other industrial use, urban uses, and so on, and climate change is increasing the water cycle as well. Having said that, then let's review SDG 6 on WASH from a nutrition perspective. Obviously, it goes without saying that water is integral in the food system, and improved food systems in return are essential to meet SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation. But both of them, both SDG 2 on zero hunger and SDG 6 on WASH, are not on track. Water is exerting increasingly negative impacts on food system outcomes. And on the other hand, food systems are increasingly stressing water systems. So one of the challenges, even though it is many, one of the challenges is a lack of coordination among water and food system actors, everybody operating in their own silos that put water, food security, and nutrition strategies not to work as they are intended. So usually we tend to get suboptimal outcomes in both indicators or in both areas. And in the coming 5-6 slides, I will talk about specific targets of SDG 6 and try to see what's missing from a nutrition angle. So target 6.1 of SDG 6, for instance, talks about universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. But obviously, this is not just a water issue. Access to safe water is associated with reduced incidence of enteric infection, of disease in pregnant women, reduced maternal and neonatal mortality rates, and improved nutrition outcomes for children. This is established already in the literature. And providing sufficient water facilities alone, of course, will not guarantee proper use nor impact on public health, but that's a start. As a result, communities need the necessary knowledge to prevent WASH-related diseases and need to be included in the design and maintenance of those facilities. If you go to another target of SDG 6 that deals with achieving access to adequate and equitable sanitation and hygiene for all and end open defecation, that's also very closely related to nutritional outcomes of women and children in particular. For instance, 14% of the decline in stunting between 1970 and 2010 is a result of improved sanitation. So when we talk about SDG 6 and its specific indicators, we are also at the same time moving the nutrition agenda forward. Reducing the practice of open defecation may have the greatest impact on child health, even though some of the literature is mixed on WASH, on undernutrition, the impact of WASH on undernutrition. And the problem is serious because in 2015, 892 million people practiced open defecation and 2.3 billion people lack adequate sanitation and facilities. With regard to target 6.3 of SDG 6, that is on improving water quality by reducing pollution, eliminating dumping, and increasing recycling. Again, that is really related to nutrition and health. For instance, more than 330 cubic kilometer of water is mostly untreated wastewater, which is 4 times the Nile River, is discharged globally to rivers, lakes, and seas every year. And obviously, severe pathogen pollutions affect around 1/3 of all river stretches in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, with adverse impacts on human health and nutrition. With regard to 6.4, increasing water use efficiency, ensuring sustainable withdrawal of fresh water and reduce, one can also create a link between nutrition and this SDG indicator, because reducing water scarcity and more sustainable water withdrawals can support nutrition and health outcomes. So there is a call for progress on sustainable agricultural water use, particularly as it relates to agriculture, because that is the main source of water, user of withdrawn water. The same thing can be done, can be discussed with 6.5, which is related to implementing integrated water resource management at all levels, even though there has been little discussion and work so far. I think there is a need to go further and try to understand what's the role of integrated water resource management, how can that be related or can contribute better to productive uses and nutritional outcomes. Target 6.6, this is the last target I think I will look at, is protecting and restoring water-related ecosystems related to mountains, forests, wetland, rivers, and aquifers. Obviously, conservation of watersheds has protective effects on child health and nutrition by reducing seasonal water shortages, sediment loads, and the incidence of waterborne disease. So there is a need to clearly establish the relationship between these water targets on nutrition and health outcomes of a wide variety of or section of the population. So the key gaps are a lack of understanding and action on linkages between agricultural water use, which is a key human water use, and nutrition. There is a lack of understanding and the need for investment in water to ensure nutrition under more variable water supplies, droughts, floods, and climate change. So there is also a need to understand women's and men's role in achieving water and food security together. And in the next few slides, I'll try to go a little bit further on and then focus on particularly irrigation from other aspects of water, particularly irrigation, and try to establish why we think irrigation is linked to nutrition, but what we found in our different studies in Ethiopia, Ghana, Tanzania, and Mali. The hypothesis is clear. The way irrigation is implemented, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of its source, its technology, the type of crops grown, can affect nutrition positively or negatively. And we need to have that nutrition lens as we look into the performance of irrigation systems. Potential pathways from irrigation to nutrition might take the form of production, income, wash, health risks, and gender. And I'll try to briefly go through these 5 slides. These are not the only pathways, but I'll try to discuss why we think these are important. With regard to production pathways, obviously we all know that irrigation leads to higher yields, particularly when it is combined with improved varieties and complementary inputs. It also provides an additional cropping season, particularly during the lean season. It tends to have some impact on the type of crops and the diversity of crops that is grown by irrigation. The literature is not consistent on this one because it also depends on what type of irrigation is put in place. There are a tendency for irrigation to focus more on vegetables and fruits because they are usually targeted for markets. And as a result, they also make fruits and vegetables available at the household level and at the community level. There are research showing that irrigation is being used for production of animal foods through irrigated fodder. So there is the fact that irrigation provides or extends the production season it tends to increase the availability of food from own production and for the community for the surrounding community, even for those who are not irrigating. But as I started earlier, irrigation tends to get 2 to 3 times more income per unit of land, and it tends to be highly intensified. So as a result, the income effect, it tends to be very high. So even though irrigation is used for vegetables and fruits and so on, irrigators tend to have the high income potential to purchase other goods, for instance, animal source foods and so on. There is also a wash argument to be made for the linkage between water and nutrition, particularly when there are multiple uses. And in many cases, irrigation water is used for other purposes other than irrigation, such as drinking, washing, bathing, or other productive purposes like livestock watering and aquaculture. So, for instance, Van der Hol 2002 has shown that greater water for domestic purposes has led to lower diarrhea and stunting in Pakistan. But of course, there are also other negative unintended consequences potentially. For instance, increased risk of vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue could be there as a result of irrigation. But having said that, the literature, at least this is not established well for small-scale irrigation. We have done small-scale this type of malaria screening with finger pricking in Ethiopia, and we didn't find any significant difference between areas irrigating and non-irrigating. So it also depends on what type of, whether it is a large scale, whether it is a small scale, the type of water application, whether the water is staying on the field for long, and so on. So, but potentially there could be negative health outcomes. But at the same time, the fact that farmers are getting high income from irrigation also allows them to increase their spending on health and treatment and prevention. The last path is the women's empowerment pathway. And to the extent gender lens has been considered in the design, operation, and use of irrigation, the fact that we are providing productive assets for women might influence women's empowerment. The fact that, I mean, particularly when women are involved in irrigation, which they are in many cases, they may allocate resources gained from the sale of irrigated crops towards food and health expenditure. This is some studies have shown that a woman may use irrigation to grow more nutritious foods for home consumption, but also it might have a potentially negative effect due to the time burden it has on time. That also depends or needs to be qualified by the type of technology that is introduced. So there is that gender lens that needs to be layered on the introduction, construction, and implementation of irrigation schemes. Having said that, we have tried to test this hypothesis in different contexts, particularly in Ethiopia, Ghana, and Tanzania, and lately in Mali, through the Innovation Lab for Small-Scale Irrigation project. We tried to collect 2 rounds of data. We tried to exploit quasi-experimental approaches. And in Ethiopia, for instance, in one study, this came out in maternal and child nutrition last year, there is high seasonal variation in women's diet in general, whether irrigators or non-irrigators, but that seasonality of women's diet can be partly offset by irrigation practices. I don't know if you can see this clearly, but we took this data from 3 seasons in a year, and the variability is higher for non-irrigators compared to irrigators. And irrigators tend to have a higher animal source foods compared to non-irrigators. And this has, it is in a way robust, or even with different econometric models, we have shown that irrigation buffers seasonal dietary gaps for women. We are trying we are doing the analysis on child level outcomes, but we have seen already that impact on women's diet. There is also impact at the level of micronutrients in women's diet. Irrigators have higher consumption of vitamin C and calcium in the irrigation and fasting seasons in Ethiopia. And they have also higher consumption of iron few months after the rainy period. And among households who reported having faced drought, we have also seen that women in irrigating households have higher dietary diversity compared to women in non-irrigating households. This is also from the same study in maternal and child nutrition. In Tanzania as well, we found that women in irrigating households have higher dietary diversity compared to non-irrigators. But the key thing here, which is different, is the difference between irrigators and non-irrigators more than doubles among households facing drought. So irrigation is becoming a really important, resilient mechanism to smooth out dietary diversity particularly when faced with shocks such as drought. In another quasi-experimental difference in difference approach, we also looked at whether the 2016 drought event, the El Nino Southern Oscillation effect in Ethiopia, what's the impact of what is the role of irrigation? We tried to see the role of irrigation in farmers' resilience to the drought. The 2015-2016 drought, by the way, is one of the worst drought the country has faced, even worse than the previous drought 2-3 decades ago. And we have seen that as a result, because partly we had data before and after the drought and with and without irrigators, we were able to exploit this difference in differences approach. And we found that the drought had serious impact on rain-fed farmers. For instance, rain-fed farmers have seen a decline of net crop income by about 37%. Area cultivated of rain-fed farmers were reduced by 8%, dietary diversity by 3%, household dietary diversity by 3%, and the share of harvest sold was reduced by 10% for rain-fed farmers. But irrigators maintained, even those irrigators that were affected by the drought, maintained their net crop income, their area cultivated, their household dietary diversity score, and the share of harvest sold. And they were able to do so because they were able to increase their daily expenditure on food by about 72% of their average daily food expenditure in the pre-drought period. So irrigation was a key climate-smart agricultural intervention that improved the resilience of farming households in the face of major weather shocks. Again, when it comes to the impact of irrigation on child level outcomes, we have seen that particularly in Ethiopia, children in irrigating households, children under 5 years of age in irrigating households have a weight for height z-scores, which is a good indicator of wasting. They have higher weight for height. Let me say that again. Children in irrigating households have weight for height z-scores that are 0.87 standard deviations higher on average than the weight for height z-scores of children in non-irrigating households. And in Tanzania, irrigation leads to higher weight for height Z-scores in children under 5 among households who reported having experienced a drought in the 5 years preceding the survey. These detailed studies can be found again on another maternal and child nutrition study that came out in earlier this year, or in the middle of this year, I think. In Ghana, there is we have seen a modest difference in the overall household dietary diversity score between irrigators and non-irrigators. And there are significant differences in the consumption of animal source foods between irrigators and non-irrigators. But then the key thing is, okay, what are the entry points for improved nutritional outcomes through irrigation? And a recent guideline, a collaboration between IFPRI and the World Bank, tried to show these different entry points that starts from incorporating nutritional considerations at concept stage of irrigation mechanisms, that includes leveraging community platforms to deliver nutrition messaging, that includes promoting nutrient-dense crops and incorporating home gardens, including designing multiple use water systems and so on. So this guideline, irrigation guideline, has also been translated into French, and both the English version and the French version are available online. But this also shows the need for monitoring. There is a need to monitor nutrition, the fact that irrigation is nutrition sensitive, and that same guideline also had suggestion on what type of indicators water managers and irrigation managers can use, or development agents can use to monitor the nutrition sensitivity of irrigation. Having said that, zooming out again to the bigger picture on the water and the food system, the question then is, particularly in the global food security paper that Sarah mentioned earlier, we asked what can be done to avoid water systems from starving food systems and food systems from draining water resources. And in that study, we provided 7 intervention areas that can help overcome siloed SDG 2 and SDG 6 developments for resilient and sustainable food system transformation. And I will end my presentation by mentioning these 7 intervention areas. So the first one is strengthening efforts to retain water-dependent ecosystems and their functions and services. I'm sorry. So the ecological processes underlying the movement, storage, and transformation of water are fundamental for sustainable and productive food systems, but these ecosystems are under severe threat from deforestation. Not just deforestation, but also erosion and pollution. And so the first task is to halt deforestation and destruction of water regulating ecosystems. And invest in nature-based solutions. These are not a panacea, but there is a room for investing, a need for investing nature-based solutions that mimic natural processes to enhance water availability. The second solution provided in that study is improving agricultural water management for food security and nutrition. This doesn't have to be just for irrigation, because both rain-fed and irrigated systems play essential roles in lowering the prices of nutrient-dense foods. So supporting rain-fed systems through investments such as terracing, soil bunds, and so on is important. At the same time, there is a need to support irrigation systems to make them water use efficient, to make them or to use integrated water storage solutions, and so on. The third solution is in terms of reducing water and food losses beyond the farm gate. One study particularly showed that much of the food losses from food supply is within the food supply chain. For instance, the study showed that lost and wasted food crops account for 24% of total freshwater resources used in food crop production. So the water losses from food losses are particularly higher for vegetables and fruits, and they are high. They have high water consumption, but they are also the crops that are highly likely to be irrigated. So reducing food loss is at the same time reducing water losses for irrigation as well as other water sources. There is, as I alluded to earlier, there is a need for coordination, particularly for coordination of nutrition and health interventions, particularly at the lowest appropriate levels. And the Brian et al., the guideline I mentioned earlier, is a good start for that. There is also a solution suggested in terms of integrating environmental sustainability in food systems and particularly diets. I think I'm running out of time. Yeah, so integrating environmental systems in food is important. The water footprint of diets varies dramatically between rich and poor countries, and also by socioeconomic groups within a country. So particularly a recent review showed that the use of precipitation and irrigation water across diets, this study showed that healthier diets could reduce, obviously, the use of precipitation, but not of irrigation in total food consumption. So what it is okay to suggest that dietary compositions need to be more focused on into fruits and vegetables, but we also need to consider the water footprint of what we are suggesting. So food-based dietary guidelines should consider the environmental footprints of proposed diets. There is a need for explicitly addressing social inequities. Vulnerable groups need to be proactively included in the development of water services, including incorporating their needs and constraints into infrastructure design. For instance, for women, they need access to credit for irrigation technologies, but that access to credit need not be tied to collateral, because women are less likely to have that, or it shouldn't have a high upfront costs. And there are things that needs to be considered. For instance, given the time burden women have, they are more likely to prefer labor-saving irrigation technologies. So this type of needs of vulnerable groups need to be taken into account in all stages of water investment. There is a need for improving the monitoring of water food system linkages. So basically, this one is saying better and more data is needed to understand the water food system linkages of diets and devise policies to that co-maximizes water and food security and nutrition goals. These are some of the related works I mentioned here, not all, but some of the related works on this one. And I think that will be the last of my slides. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation, Dawit. Lots of questions here from the audience. I know you have to leave a few minutes early, so I'll start with the questions, and maybe you can just signal me when you need to end. So the first question comes from Susan Elliott, and she asks, does addressing SDG 6 empower women, or does addressing SDG 5 address global water insecurity?
I think both. I mean, I just focused on SDG 2 and SDG 6 because our focus was on water and nutrition, but I think that a good case can be made for SDG 5 as well.
Okay. The next question is it's from an anonymous attendee, and they say, thank you very much for a great presentation. The importance of irrigation is clear. So the question remains, perhaps, as in urban residential areas, how will we fund the necessary investments in irrigation technology? How do we build a sustainable business model that ensures that the more vulnerable groups in society, who are typically also poorer and have much lower ability to pay for these necessary investments?
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think we have to be able to find a way to provide financial mechanisms, credits, and we have to be creative in the sense that given the resource constraints of these households, then you have to be able to also design the repayment mechanism so that it is not burdensome upfront, and perhaps you need to design it so that they pay back after harvest instead of at the beginning. And with that type of facilitation of credit and with appropriate extension systems, and in most cases, the extension system will leave out irrigation. At least in many countries, it focuses mostly on grains in Africa, and the vegetables and the fruits and vegetables are usually forgotten. So irrigation in general tends to be outside the focus of extension agents. So we need to put that in place in addition to the credit. But more importantly, we also need to make it sustainable, but because we need to think about the market before it is produced, because it is possible that even after these high investments and debts on investments, it might not pay back unless the market is ready, particularly for irrigated vegetables and fruits, which tends to be spoiled easily. So we need to consider the whole chain from production, access to credit, production, marketing, and post-harvest storage.
Thank you. So our next question comes from Pedrag, who says, thank you for the very informative presentation. Does water footprint vary more across country averages or across socioeconomic groups within countries?
The study shows both. There are, the water footprint varies across countries and also within groups, within a country, not just geographically, but also across different income groups. So there is definitely, so which one is higher in terms of variation across countries or within a country is a debate to be had, but I think it varies both across countries and within a given country. That's my take on that.
Okay, thank you very much. One more question from an anonymous attendee. How do we raise awareness of policymakers about your results?
Yeah, so we try to create awareness in different formats, and I think this is one avenue to do that. We tried to provide policy briefs in different countries. We tried to work with, to partner with Ministry of Water, Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Agriculture in different countries. But again, more needs to be done. I mean, we have country presences that try, and for instance, recently we give this talk twice in Ethiopia for public health authorities, a couple of times, and the same thing we did in Ghana. There are presentations made to different donors in the US. So the message being that Once we establish that there is a strong linkage between irrigation and nutrition, then what we are pitching is then irrigation needs to be promoted in its merit to improve nutrition, not just in terms of its merit on increasing yield, increasing income, but also there is a nutrition message, and there is a need to invest in irrigation, and we try to do that and to spread that as much as possible, but definitely more needs to be done. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm not seeing any more questions. Maybe I'll just give it one more second. We have a couple more minutes for questions if anybody has any. I will say the first question really resonated with me. I last week happened to be in northern Ghana in a small community speaking to women who talked about the need to irrigate their crops, but also talked about what it was like to be a woman in their community and just how much work they have to do. So, you know, from fetching the water to looking after the children, to cooking the meals, to worrying about the health of their family. And it's a chicken and egg question, right? What comes first? Can we relieve some of that burden by empowering the women, or do we need to, you know, improve the irrigation, improve the water security situation so that they are empowered?
Exactly. I should add that this study is also done in northern Ghana, in Upper East region of Ghana, and agriculture in that area is also very much women activity, because in the dry season, the men tends to do a lot of cross-border trading with Togo, and most of the work is agricultural work is being done by women, and most of the irrigation is using buckets, from fetching using buckets and cans. So then you need to consider both. I mean, we provided through an NGO, we provided a motorized pump that the women appreciated because it reduces their labor burden. But at the same time, when irrigation is going to become more motorized, the household dynamics might change, something we need to follow. But I think I completely agree with you that question is really important.
Yeah. I see one last question from an anonymous participant. It says, you seem to identify the most important pathways to link irrigation to nutrient. You mentioned there are more. Can you give examples?
Yeah, so for instance, we looked at this production income and income pathways and health. We didn't dwell much on the wash aspect, the multiple use aspect. We haven't done much in that study in our analysis. For instance, there could be unintended consequences of multiple use services that needs careful attention, because it is easy to trigger pollution from chemicals of irrigation and other products if you are using the same water for domestic use, for animal purposes, for irrigation and so on. That type of nuances needs to be really understood. We have seen that the irrigation improves, multiple use improves in access to water, but should we be concerned about pollution? And that is another angle that needs more discussion. These are the things that just came on top of my head, but I think more pathways other people can identify.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think we can end the question and answer session here. And I want to thank you, Dawit, very much for your excellent presentation again and for answering our questions today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. And
yeah, we're delighted that you are able to join. I'd also like to thank Inga Jacob Mata again for her keynote address earlier today, as well as our panelists, Archizman Mitra and Julian Sohn, as well as Roy for stepping in to moderate the panel. So just in closing, I'm going to say that I saw a few recurring themes come up today. So one of them was a critical role of policy in achieving water security. I think that was talked about by everybody who spoke today. And, you know, highlighted by the question, I can't remember who asked it, but, you know, how do we raise this? How do we get our policy, or, you know, the results of the work and the research that's done into policy? I also heard, I think every speaker talk about the need for transdisciplinary work to achieve water security. And it makes me think back to education. I remember when I graduated from undergrad, I had a very disciplinary view of water and what water security is. And it wasn't until I, you know, launched into my research career and started working with all these other groups that I came to understand just how critical, including all disciplines, but also cooperation between sectors, which I heard Dawit talk about. So I think that that's something, you know, that needs to be embedded into undergraduate education a little bit more. And, you know, I heard the panelists talk about one of the benefits of the QES was the environment that they were exposed to that allowed them to work in these transdisciplinary areas. So I think from my perspective, those were the overarching themes that I heard about today. And with that, I'd just like to thank everybody again for participating today. And special thanks to our keynote speakers and to our panelists. And remind everybody that we will be back again tomorrow at 7 a.m. for day 3. And lots more exciting speakers and panelists tomorrow. So we very much hope you can join us then.